Talk a little bit about surveillance in our feral swine. So just want to tell you a little bit about our disease program. Around the turn of the century, we noticed that we had some real issues. West Nile disease broke, and we realized that we had surveillance, communication, detection, reporting all failed. We really had a need for One Health, all three aspects. Then the outbreak in the UK with foot and mouth disease, SARS, monkeypox, brought the point home that we need to be paying attention what's happening in our animals, and our wild animals, and our livestock, and in man. Then in 2001, 9/11, we realized that not only did we have natural introductions to worry about, but now we had people out there who would purposely introduce a foreign animal disease, which really changed the whole scenario. The non-laboratory system was initiated in 2002 for surge capacity, and we needed we had a real opportunity to put something in place where we could have real cooperation between our ag and wildlife agencies. And Wildlife Services was uniquely qualified to handle that kind of a role. We hired our first group of disease biologists in 2004. Their job was to establish and implement a program. We had about one biologist per state. They were the liaison between the state between the ag and wildlife agencies within the state, and they were also our emergency responders. 2004 came a declaration from the OIE that wildlife disease surveillance is the overarching key element in transboundary animal disease preparedness. Spring 2006, we really started to think about surveillance when it looked like we might be looking at H5N1 translocation from China to the mainland U.S. Conducted large-scale surveillance for 5 years. Learned an awful lot about surveillance programs during that time. Hired additional biologists in additional states. And then in 2014, we had the first introduction of AI into our country in Washington. Because we had all of our people ready to go, we were able to get 5,000 samples in the month of December. We had that outbreak at the end of November, so through December, we tried to get as many samples as we could in the Pacific Flyway. We were able to gather 5,000 samples, and about 1% of those were positive. If we would have missed that window, there would have been a lot that we would have lost in our knowledge that we gained about AI in that point in time. A little bit about feral swine diseases. Classical swine fever requested Wildlife Services to become part of their surveillance stream in 2006. And we piggybacked, so to speak, the rest of our surveillance on top of that. And then in 2014, the Feral Swine Damage Management Program was initiated and funded. And this really allowed us to expand our feral swine surveillance. Our diseases of concern are zoonotic diseases, transboundary, and ag diseases with a wildlife reservoir. One little piggy is cute, but a lot of little piggies cause problems. It seems like the better the environment, the more they like to destroy it, whether it be public lands, parks, golf courses, crops, and in addition to the destruction, and also they're very tough on native wildlife, especially endangered species. And not only are they really destructive to the environment, but we know they carry many diseases. And one of the biggest problems is that people really like to hunt them. So they'll readily move them from one part of the country to another. Why should I go to Georgia to hunt pigs when I can bring them to my backyard in Ohio? So, in addition to being readily expanding their population naturally, we can expand their population even faster with a pickup truck. And these animals can have lots of babies in a single year. Found throughout much of North America, various legal classifications, from pests to game species, most prevalent in the southeast and Texas, and significant expansion in the last 40 years. 4 to 5 million of these guys, non-native, invasive, 38 states, 3 provinces, 400 pounds, multiple litters per year, and multiple pigs per litter. high parasite load, disease reservoir, and a popular hunting species. You add all of that together and you have a recipe for disaster. Just a little map to show the increase in population over time. So in the last 40 years, they have really expanded their range and their numbers. Share pathogens with livestock, wildlife, pets and working dogs, and man. And they're really adaptable, wide variety of climates and habitats. In the old days, we thought that they couldn't live out of the south, that they need a fairly warm environment. We've discovered that's not true. If they can find something to eat, they do very well. And when it comes to something to eat, they're really adaptable with what they can make a living on. Just a few of the many diseases that are associated with feral swine. And readily interact with other livestock on the environment, whether they be dairy cows, beef cows, or transitional swine. Most of our surveillance has been in the southeast, Texas, and California. We publish a manual every year for our disease biologists, and we've recently moved to targeted surveillance, and we're trying to perfect that. Here's an example of targeted surveillance. We like to try to get surveillance in areas of these landfills, especially landfills that receive international garbage. And here's an example of we try to target our surveillance in areas with high swine concentrations as well, high commercial swine. And here's an example of a pig that was killed right outside of a confinement operation. Just some of the criteria we use for to determine our targeted surveillance. And and APHIS has labeled 26 states as high risk for CSF, and these are some of the criteria that have been used to identify those states. Most of our surveillance has been serosurveillance, but we have done some surveillance for the pathogen as well. About 36 states per year, and about 3,500 animals are sampled per year. Usually heart blood. Sometimes we can take blood as well from the rete at the base of the brain. Classical swine fever, as we mentioned, that was the original motivator for our program, for our surveillance in feral swine. And we have some really good diagnostic tests available that make classical swine fever serosurveillance a really efficient tool in swine brucellosis. Swine brucellosis was eradicated from the commercial swine industry in the early 2000s. It's a very serious zoonotic disease, can be transmitted to humans and other mammals. The symptoms can range from relatively minor flu-like to chronic disease that is very, very hard to cure. Most of the pigs that we see with Brucella are indeed suis, but occasionally we find a pig out there with Brucella abortus as well. And as you can imagine, this really complicates the verification of B. abortus-free states. Often get positive milk ring tests and the like, and then we have to try to tease out whether we're looking at abortus or we're looking at suis. We'll talk a little bit more about what we've learned with swine brucellosis, in that it looks like our serosurveillance really underestimates the prevalence of this disease. A little while back in 2014, we looked at actual pathogen surveillance in areas with a high incidence of serosurveillance, and that was the first time that we discovered that I think throughout our whole career, especially with APHIS, we've often painted suis with the abortus brush. We use abortus antigens, and abortus has always been a more important disease. But suis and abortus are really quite different. For instance, we discovered that in this particular trial, only 50% of our culture positive animals were indeed serologically positive. Pseudorabies, very similar to to suis. We spent a lot of time and effort eradicating this from the commercial flock, from the commercial herd. However, it does persist in our feral swine, particularly sad and serious disease when it affects hunting dogs. Also is a significant issue in trying to preserve the Florida panther. Influenza A, we see a fair amount of evidence of serologic evidence for influenza A, but very little evidence of active shedding. We also look at diseases that are common in the swine industry, such as PRRS, very small incidence of PRRS that we were able to locate or demonstrate in our ferals. Lepto, emerging disease. We're seeing a very high evidence, high serologic evidence in our ferals, and a moderate pathogen evidence as well. Pigs have long been considered a reservoir of TB in certain places of the world, such as Eurasian wild boar in Spain, actually even feral hogs in Molokai. So we've conducted surveillance to determine whether or not we had Mycobacterium bovis in our ferals. We've done serologic surveillance, and we've also done pathogen detection with a pathologic surveillance. And in neither case were we able to demonstrate any bovis in our pigs. And we're currently conducting a new serologic survey along the border to see if anything has changed since we've done that original work back about 3 or 4 years ago. So, I think we're starting to see a pattern here, okay? The diseases that we've eradicated from our domestic herd are alive and well in our feral swine. Trick and toxo, just another good example of that. So, diseases that we spend a lot of time and money to eradicate in our domestic hogs are, for the most part, alive and well in our ferals. We had an opportunity to do some work in Texas. They have slaughter plants in Texas that actually slaughter feral swine, and apparently the meat actually fetches a premium. So we really had the opportunity to get really good samples, about as close to a laboratory as you could get. So we went down there, we collected about 400 samples, and we looked at that situation again when we were comparing seroprevalence to culture prevalence, and we discovered the same thing. About 13% of those pigs were culture positive, 10% were seropositive, but only 33% of the culture positives were serologically positive. So we definitely have a disconnect there, and that's some work that we need to conduct, try to figure out what exactly is going on there. We've also looked at Seneca. We found that in a few states. We've also looked at PED and found that we could see it in our ferals about a year after it was first described in domestic pigs. Various other projects as well. Serica hepatitis E, Neospora. Now, in Ames, they actually did some work suggesting that swine may indeed be susceptible to chronic wasting disease. So we're trying to ground truth that in Arkansas, where we have an area of Arkansas with a lot of feral pigs and also also a high incidence of chronic wasting disease. So that's a little project that we're working on as we speak. So currently we're trying to work along the border, try to see if our ferals, if we can determine any incidence of TB in those pigs, serological or cultural evidence. Our little project in Arkansas, and we're also looking at a pathogenesis and immunology project in Fort Collins, trying to tease out those issues with brucellosis in feral swine. We also have an archive, about 26,000 samples in that archive from 26,000 different individuals, and we also have a genetics archive as well. This is something that was in the news not too long ago. In this particular case, the Brucella was RB51, which is a vaccine strain, but it very, very easily could have been something like Suis. Here's a situation where a hunter made a bunch of sausage out of his feral swine, out of the feral swine that he shot, and shared it with his friends, and his friends broke with brucellosis. And these pigs pretty much go anywhere and do anything. So, we had the lettuce situation a little while back, but I mean, these pigs are virtually unrestricted. They can very easily go from area to area and pick up and shed pathogens as they go. How are we doing on time? We still okay? Okay, here, we've come to the fun part. Now, so how do these guys lay their hands on these pigs, you ask? Well, one way is helicopter aerial gunning. Okay, this is actually in Ohio. And you can see the shotgun in this picture here. And in the old days, they used to use traps. And these traps would have triggers. So when the pigs would go in, the door would shut. Well, now these guys, everybody is so high-tech. So here's a trap. So you can see they've got the little corral set up, and then they have that little trap set up, the little trap door. Well, what they do is they monitor that trap door with a camera. So at night, in front of the television, he's monitoring his trap. And then when he sees them go in there, he can quick set it. So it's pretty neat. So this is just some pictures of some night vision. So there's a pig, and then you can see the open door there. Here's some pigs that are in a trap in daylight. Once again, just a bunch of pigs, and that the trapper is monitoring to see when the pigs actually come in. Otherwise, he could just get one pig and lose all the rest of those. Or he could lose that great big sow that he really wants to get. Just another example, the feed on the inside, the pigs on the outside, and the trapper watching for them to come in. Boom, trap door goes down, success. Next morning, that's what they find in their trap. Except everybody likes a free meal. So and a lot of these places are really tough to get to. So I've always been impressed with our people. They're real wizards. If it's possible, they figure it out. So they can get their little four-wheeler in there and set up a trap where you wouldn't think you could hardly walk. So, do I still have time? 10. Okay. Well, why are we worried about all of this? Well, one of the reasons we're worried about this are the foreign animal diseases. I think that's probably one of the major reasons. Here we have a hemorrhagic gastrohepatic lymph node. Here we have a extensive perirenal edema, a really big spleen here. Get a little closer look at that kidney. We have just all kinds of edema associated with that kidney. We've got a great big friable spleen, cracks when you manipulate it. Once again, red hemorrhagic lymph nodes that almost look like blood clots. All of those lesions would be associated with African swine fever. Then we have lesions associated with classical swine fever, the turkey egg kidney, the splenic infarcts, both the white and the red variety. Once again, turkey egg kidney. You've got your lesions in your tonsils, your tonsillar abscesses, and you've got your reactive lymph nodes. Not as hemorrhagic as the African, but definitely enlarged and reactive. We also took some feral hogs to Plum to see how they would respond, and they responded quite classically. Just some lesion development. We've got an interdigital area. You can just start to see the accumulation of fluid. There you have a nice little vesicle. Vesicle ruptures. Heals very rapidly. Part of the problem was the pigment. It was kind of hard to see what was going on. And part of the problem was that these pigs were pretty tough. And they didn't demonstrate the degree of lameness that we see in our domestic animals. And once again, just like all these feet lesions, as long as secondary infections don't arise, they heal very well. And you can actually see some abnormal horn growth from the effect of the lesion on the coronary band. More of the same. So our ferals are indeed susceptible. Just an example of a lesion here. Once again, because they're black, they're a little tougher to see. Vesicles pops up, ruptures, heals very rapidly. And the classical sites for lesions in these pigs are going to be the tip of the tongue. In these pigs, we often have what we call a dry lesion. It's undermined, but you don't see a great big old vesicle. The interdigital area, the coronary band, and the tip of the snout. So anytime I can get a chance to share lesions, it always makes my day. So.